Amongst the largest nations in the world, home to over 20% of its population, Brazil and India are also home to a host of inequalities. Both countries are large, growing emerging markets gaining prominence in global economy. Ironically, neither has been able to transfer the benefits of growth fairly to their citizens. Brazil has long been one of the most unequal countries in the world. India in past was less unequal, but in recent years disparities have been on the rise, while Brazil has had some success in stemming inequality. What makes the third and the seventh largest economies of the world such hotbeds of inequality? Why are workers in India and Brazil faced with such huge gaps in wages and incomes? How are the trends in the two countries different? And what can we learn from comparing them? The research project Labour Market Inequality in Brazil and India brings together scholars from both the countries to share each other's experiences and understand mechanisms behind inequality in each country.
With the rise of China, Brazil, India, South Africa, they are called emerging economies. We felt that there is need to engage more with these countries. And in this context, several activities ISD undertook, one big international seminar, also with support from IDRC, a workshop on social protection comparing these all countries. With IDRC support, we went to participate in their big labor economics conference organized by ABET in Brazil, and this idea concretized to undertake some comparative research.
Looking back at growth and inequality over several decades, India and Brazil appear to be almost the mirror images of each other. Since the 1950s, both countries have had a similar average growth rate between 4 to 5% per annum. But Brazil grew rapidly up to 1980, while India's growth was slow. This pattern reversed after 1980, when growth shot up in India and dropped in Brazil. Mirror image is reflected in equality too. Inequality rose rapidly in Brazil till the 1980s, started declining in 1990s and fell sharply after 2000. Inequality in India showed little change until the 1990s, but then started to rise. Available data, however, only allowed us to compare income inequality in Brazil and expenditure in India. If same measures are used for both countries, inequality would today be much the same in both. Understanding these patterns requires a close look at histories and growth regimes of both countries. Growth regimes are made up of economic and social institutions and policies like organization of industry and agriculture, type of international integration, role of the state, functioning of markets for goods, labor, finance, and forms of social inclusion and exclusion. Growth regimes determine the pace of growth and the way its benefits are shared.
The paths over time of poverty and inequality are different, but this difference, we want to look at them from the perspectives of the growth regimes. We need to look at the whole thing in order to see which role did inequality play in both growth regimes in different times. It's important to notice that the times in which GDP grew faster, like late 60s to 1980 in Brazil, and 1991 to 2014 in India, are the periods in which inequality rose at the fastest levels, like in this country's history.
Brazil saw heavy industrialization in the period before 1980. It was led by the state but built on private investment, both domestic and foreign. Economy grew and so did the industrial workforce and urbanization. In a segmented labor market, a formal, protected workforce emerged, though wages were low. A large informal economy functioned alongside. Output increased, and so did inequality and social and political tensions. Partly as a result, a period of deep economic and social crisis followed after 1980. Economic liberalization in the 1990s was unable to deliver growth, but threw up a new political order in which the state played an important redistributive role. Decline in inequality came mainly after 2000, when high growth led to steady creation of formal jobs, increasing minimum wages and social benefits. In India, state-led industrialization after independence faltered in the mid-60s. Until the end of the 1970s, economy depended heavily on agriculture, though agrarian reforms were limited. Growth was low and there was no foreign investment. The industrial workforce remained small and poverty levels changed little. Redistribution of wealth was mostly from the rich to middle-income groups. 1980s onwards, liberalization led to higher growth and rising incomes. But there was little creation of industrial employment and the labor market remained dominated by casual work and informal employment. Inequality rose as output grew faster than wages and benefits were concentrated. After 2000, there was a boom in services and construction sector, but good jobs remained scarce. The rise in inequality was moderated after 2005 by policies such as MGNREGA and poverty declined. Nevertheless, sharp divides in access to new opportunities persisted. So the stories of two countries are different, but the comparison is worthwhile. In both India and Brazil, inequality in labor market is manifested in large gaps in wages and unemployment between different groups. One of the biggest gaps is between formal and informal workers. In India, formal work with social security and effective legal rights is mainly concentrated among regular factory workers and in the public sector. The majority of wage workers are in casual and contract employment. Most self-employed workers also lack protection and income security. The Unorganized Workers' Social Security Act of 2008 aims to provide social security benefits to workers in the unorganized sectors, and many workers are also entitled to minimum wages. But the rules are poorly applied. There is also a great deal of informal employment in activities outsourced and subcontracted from the formal sector. These divides are also present in Brazil, but to a lesser extent, since the majority of workers have a formal contract and signed labor card which documents their rights. In both countries, workers in the informal economy are vulnerable to exploitation and lack the qualifications that allow access to formal jobs. Gender is another important dimension of inequality amongst workers. Women have narrower employment opportunities, receive lower wages and have less access to skills training, leaving them further disadvantaged in the labor market. Gender wage differentials have come down in both countries, but are still large in India. Social divides like caste and community in India and race or skin color in Brazil run deep in both countries. Caste continues to play a divisive role in the Indian labor market, with scheduled tribes particularly disadvantaged. Lower caste workers are mostly concentrated in informal work. Caste differences are surprisingly persistent even in urban areas. In Brazil, the segmentation of jobs by race, a legacy of slavery, is less sharp, but differences between whites and non-whites are slow to disappear. In both countries, there are also large and persistent regional inequalities.
Historical inequality among population groups with different origins, but with similar effects, give rise to unequal labor market opportunities, and these are reflected in labor market structure. In India, the primary mechanism is one of exclusion of lower castes from good jobs, whereas in Brazil, there are more open job access, but larger wage differentials within labor market segments, which might, for instance, reflect a more limited option for progression for non-whites. The results of point to the effect of pre-labor market inequality, which are reflected by the low education attainment of non-whites in Brazil, and the unequal access to education and also jobs for lower castes in India.
What sorts of labour market policies can make a real dent in inequality? There are two big issues here. The first is getting a good, productive job. But for a decent job, you need skills and qualifications. Some young people do get good training in schools or in enterprises, but most don't. And inequality in training leads directly to inequality in employment. The second big issue is how much do you earn? It's hard to influence wages, but one thing you can do, and both India and Brazil try to do it, is set a floor, a minimum wage. That can be an important way of reducing inequality, at least at the bottom. So we decided to look in more detail at policies in these two areas in the two countries.
Minimum wages play very different roles in India and Brazil because of the difference in their structure, coverage and implementation. Brazil has an annually adjusted, unique national minimum wage system. This acts as a floor wage for formal workers and as a reference for wages of informal workers. It is also used as a benchmark for social security benefits, pensions, etc. The level of enforcement of minimum wages in Brazil is comparatively high. In sharp contrast, minimum wage rates in India vary across different occupations and states. This makes the system very complicated and difficult to enforce evenly. Minimum wages in India are not connected to any other social payments.
A big problem with minimum wages, however, remains that it's grossly violated, especially in India than in Brazil. There are several studies which have pointed this out, and I sort of provide one. Belson and Rani in their study pointed out that nearly 42% of all wage earners receive wages that are below national minimum wage floor. And at the state level of minimum wages, as we know, there are various levels of wages set in each state depending on the level, skill composition of workers and also across industries. So there are a range of minimum wages set even within a state. So taking the state level minimum wages, almost 27.2% of salaried workers and 52.3% of all casual workers are paid sub-minimum wages.
Effective implementation and full compliance of minimum wages can result in the overall reduction of labor market inequalities. In Brazil, evidence from the last decade suggests that rising minimum wages have compressed the wage scale. In association with other policies, minimum wages have made a significant contribution to reducing inequality of household incomes. But Brazil now faces a less favorable economic situation with a dip in growth. Sustainability of minimum wages as an instrument for reducing inequality poses a challenge now. Overall minimum wages have been more effective in Brazil than in India, and particularly in formal work than in informal work. In India, minimum wages could significantly reduce inequality if enforced fully at the existing levels. The biggest challenge is to formulate a simple and universal minimum wage policy for a fast-growing but segmented economy. It is argued that India should make the state-level minimum wages binding for all workers, irrespective of their coverage in the schedules of employment. This system should be strongly enforced, with active roles played by trade unions, social partners, and civil society members.
So the first step would be to have a national minimum wage. Not just the notional minimum wage, but actually a statutory national minimum wage, a floor below which no minimum wage would be fixed. Minimum wages need to be revised over a period of time, not only to sort of compensate for increase in cost of living and increase in prices, but also movement along with the general levels of development, general levels of per capita income of the people. So minimum wage, even real minimum wage should also increase, which means the increase over a period of time would be compensating not only the rise in prices, but also an increase in the levels of income in general.
Our analysis of the systems of skilling and the returns to skilling in two countries reveals skills differentiate and stratify the workforce. Poor and less educated are mostly concentrated in informal work and depend on informal training, though there are vocational training programs for those unable to attain general education, but they too impose entry barriers. Broadly, the requirement is secondary schooling in India and fundamental education in Brazil. The proportion of unskilled and informally skilled is quite high in both countries, even among youth. Both Brazil and India have multiple institutions for providing vocational education and skills training, but their impact and outreach is limited. However, both countries in the last decades have pumped greater resources into vocational education and training. Initiatives such as the Pronatec in Brazil and some state-level offshoots of the Skill Development Mission in India are more efficient and better targeted than before. India's vocational education and training system calls for improvements like better quality of training, relevance of curriculum, targeted outreach, and recognition of prior learning, among others. India should learn something from the Brazilian Pronatec, which has managed to reduce entry-level barriers. But Pronatec is yet to have a significant impact on labour market inequality. Skilling and inequality reduction is also linked with other factors such as growth and formalization of jobs, making it difficult to propose more definite policy recommendations.
High rates of economic growth lead to a concentration of income among a minority of the population, but low growth makes redistribution more difficult. Brazil successfully reduced inequality in the last 15 years because of more formal employment, higher minimum wages, and large social transfers. But the country is now facing economic crisis, and it's by no means sure that the trend to reduced inequality will continue in the future. In India, inequality is rising, along with high rates of growth. There's not much political reaction to this trend, but unless something is done, inequality will continue to grow, and will ultimately become a threat to continued economic growth. There is concern about inequality in different sections of Indian society, but that concern has not yet been translated into effective action on the scale that we have seen in Brazil.